Continuate a imparare The Tom Daniel Show. Continuate a ascoltare, continuate a imparare The Tom Daniel Show.
You're listening to The Tom Daniel Show, and I'm your host, Tom Daniel. All right, let's maybe start with a scene that some of you know really well. Picture a lively discussion, maybe even getting a little bit heated. You know, it might even be like an intervention where a whole group of people are teaming up against one determined person. And yet, no matter how much they try to shout him down, he's doing a pretty good job of holding his own. It's a very heated discussion, back and forth. And everyone's pushing back against him, but this one dude is very passionate, making his voice heard above all the others. Of course, if you watch cable news, you probably see that on a nightly basis. Now, this contrast of voices, this push and pull, might be the key you need to help understand something in classical music that can seem a bit intimidating at first: the concerto. If you think about communication, conflict, group dynamics, it can really open up a whole new perspective on something you could never really get before. So now, imagine everyone you just pictured in that argument holding a musical instrument in their hands, and instead of talking, they're playing. That is the living, breathing definition of a concerto. Now, at its heart, a concerto is basically a musical argument between one virtuoso soloist and the entire orchestra, a spirited debate in rhythm, melody, and harmony. Now, the word concerto is an Italian word. It looks like concerto, but is pronounced concerto. It's really not that far off, though, that it looks like concerto, because the word basically means concert. Now, there's a much more fancy, formal, official, dry, and boring definition of a concerto, which is a multi-movement form for a soloist accompanied by the orchestra. Wow, doesn't that sound thrilling? I mean, it's technically true, but it misses all the passion, negotiation, and lifeblood that's going on in the music. I like my definition a lot better, because the correct way to listen to a concerto is to think of it as an argument going back and forth. If you just do that, it will all suddenly make sense. Classical music is overwhelming because the people who listen to it like to pretend they're smarter than you are. If somebody played a recording of a concerto and said, "Here, listen to this, trust me, it's good, it's art," I mean, you wouldn't have any idea what to listen for. It would just be sonic wallpaper. But if you think of it as an argument, suddenly it works. I mean, you get the aha moment and it clicks. Instead of just hearing musical sounds, you'll be able to actively listen and understand. You can follow it and keep up. Now, the funny thing is, I've told classically trained musicians to think of a concerto as an argument, and I could see the light bulb go on over their heads. They never thought about it like that before. So if you're someone who gets lost listening to classical music and just doesn't get it, my goal is to change that. Okay, have you ever been in an argument with someone, and no matter what you say, they just keep hammering the same thing over and over? And you can spin your argument around and approach it from all kinds of different angles, but no matter what you say, they always repeat back the same old thing every time. Well, that's what happens in a concerto, too. You see, every time the orchestra plays, they essentially play the same thing. They just keep repeating it, or a variation of it. And musically, this is known as ritornello form, as ritornello is the Italian word for return. So the orchestra returns to the same thing each time. Now, for listeners, this is actually very helpful because it gives you this kind of a musical anchor to latch on to every time you hear it. And it also makes the different ideas of the soloist stand out even more. So the setup is really pretty clear. First, the orchestra plays, then the soloist plays, then the orchestra plays, then the soloist plays, then the orchestra plays. Just like that, back and forth, back and forth. And each time the orchestra plays, they return and play basically the same thing again. It's like a real conversation with a recurring topic. And if you actually see this performed live on stage, there's a visual component as well. Since the soloist is musically separate from the orchestra, then the soloist stands physically separate from the orchestra on the stage, all alone right at the front. Now the orchestra's all together, one big half circle behind him, and the soloist stands away from them. Now, to see a concerto performed is to get a visual reinforcement of the back and forth argument in addition to the one you can hear. You can see the whole me against the world aspect of the music. Now, the soloist doesn't face the orchestra because he's facing the audience, but, you get the point. I mentioned that in the official definition of a concerto, it is a multi-movement form, which means that the entire concerto is broken up into smaller sections called movements, which are similar to chapters in a novel. Well, how many movements? 10, 20, 30? Well, back in the 1600s, when the concerto was really taken off, the artists of the time were obsessed with the number 3 because it represented the Holy Trinity, and they liked to divide their artwork up into 3s. Plays had 3 acts. Paintings had 3 panels, and therefore the concerto has 3 movements. Oh, and here's a little tip about concert etiquette. Have you ever been to a classical concert and the orchestra played a giant ending chord, and crickets? Nobody claps, except for one goof up in the balcony clapping by himself. Nobody else clapped. They all just kind of shoot the guy in the balcony with some bad looks, but what's up with that? Why didn't anybody else clap at the end? How did they know they weren't supposed to clap right there? Well, it's because it wasn't the end. Not yet. Audiences do not clap in between the movements because it's not over yet. Now, it might feel a bit weird, but all applause is held until the end of the last movement, when the whole thing is finally finished. The whole story is told. Then you clap. So, these 3 movements, is there a pattern? How do they sound different? If you fell asleep during a concerto and woke back up, would you be able to tell which movement you were hearing? Well, at least 1/3 of the time, I guarantee you can tell. In a concerto, the movements are always in an A-B-A pattern, which means that the first and last movements match each other in some way, and the middle movement is different. So it begins A, then changes to B somehow, and then goes back to A. This provides balance, symmetry, and a touch of predictability. It always starts with A, goes somewhere else for B, and always comes back to A. Now, composers have several tools they can use to accommodate this ABA feeling. Now, tempo is a big one. Fast, slow, fast is super common. That's ABA. Or the musical key, maybe major key for A, something bright and happy, then minor key for B, more thoughtful and sad, and then back to major. Major, minor, major is ABA. Now the beat can change with a steady 2-beat feel in A, then a flowing 3-beat waltz for B, and then back to 2 beats for the final A. Or they could even vary the entire energy, so it begins active, then gets calm and peaceful, and then ends active again. So what happens if you fall asleep in the audience during a concerto? If you wake up and you hear them playing something slow, then you know you woke up during the second movement. That's always the slow one. Now, knowing this ABA thing really helps you to stay oriented. Now, the best composers like Bach or Vivaldi could juggle all those things at once. The first movement was fast, major key, 2 beats, and active, all of those things together. The second movement was the opposite, slow, minor key, 3 beats, and calm. See how that works? then you should be able to guess what the third movement would sound like. This ability to predict what's going to happen next is crucial to understanding and liking music. It helps you keep your bearings by knowing what to expect about half the time and being surprised the other half of the time. Music that does that hooks you and ropes you in. But it won't work unless you know what to expect. Music that is 100% predictable is boring because there are no surprises. Music that is 100% unpredictable is also boring because it's too confusing and you just kind of tune out. It has to be a blend and hit the sweet spot. Enough structure so you know roughly where you are, but enough variation and surprise within that structure to keep you engaged. Now, too much routine is dull, while too much chaos is exhausting. If you think of a concerto as an argument in an ABA form, then you halfway know what to expect already, and it gets good. If you know what to listen for, you can have a deeper connection and enjoy it. Now, near the end of the first movement, there's a really big show-stopping moment called a cadenza. No, not a credenza. That's a piece of furniture. It's called a cadenza in a concerto. And that's where the orchestra just stops completely. Silence. And the soloist goes off on this unaccompanied virtuosic solo. It's the flashiest part of the whole movement and kind of represents the climax of the musical argument. Not only does the orchestra sit totally silent for a few minutes, the soloist makes up the notes to play right on the spot, improvising. Imagine the pressure. The soloist gets the floor entirely and shows off everything they've got. I know, improvising is usually more associated with jazz musicians now, but back in the day, classical musicians were expected to be able to improvise too. Today, not so much. In today's world, the so-called improvised solo is actually written out and just memorized by the soloist. Still impressive, but, less spontaneous. Regardless, there's not another moment similar to a cadenza in any other classical composition, not the symphony or the string quartet or the opera or anything else. Only the concerto, and only at the end of the first movement. You're listening to The Tom Daniels Show. We'll be right back.
Cosa stai aspettando? The Tom Daniels Show. Cosa stai aspettando? The Tom Daniels Show. Cosa stai aspettando? The Tom Daniels Show.
Welcome back to The Tom Daniels Show, and I love my band Mary Mac, the world's most perfect band. We were talking about the concerto representing a musical argument between one solo instrument and the entire rest of the orchestra. So what if you wanted to supersize this whole thing? What if one soloist isn't enough drama for you? How about 3 or 4 of them? Is that legal? Well, yeah, that's called a concerto grosso. Grosso is not the Italian word for disgusting. It's the Italian word for large. So a concerto grosso is like a concerto on steroids. Instead of one soloist, there are several of them, all arguing with the orchestra, not with each other. And it's like the original soloist brought along some friends for backup. This gives the composer a couple of different combination options. It could be orchestra, then one soloist, then orchestra, then a different soloist, then orchestra, etc. Or it could be orchestra, and then the different soloists take turns with each other, and then back to the orchestra again. So many possibilities. Now remember in the regular concerto I told you that the soloist stood at the front of the stage, separate from the rest of the orchestra. Well, the same thing happens in a concerto grosso, except instead of one soloist standing alone, now there's a small group of them, and they're called a concertino. They stand together as a group, but separate from the rest of the orchestra. Well, what happens when you get to the cadenza? Do they all take turns improvising? No, that'd take all night. Only one member of the concertino takes the improvised solo in a concerto grosso cadenza, and it's up to the composer to make that decision. I guess that one soloist would be like the group representative chosen to make their final argument. By the way, if the soloist is improvising and theoretically making up everything on the spot, how does the orchestra know when he's done and it's time to come back in? Well, that happens because the soloist has worked out a prearranged signal to the orchestra so that when they hear a certain set of musical phrases, they know he's done and it's time to play again. If it's a local orchestra playing and featuring a local musician as a soloist, then they all have a lot of time to rehearse and know exactly when to come back in at the end of the cadenza. But what if it's a guest soloist who's just in town for that one performance and they only get one rehearsal? Then they got to make sure during that one rehearsal that everybody understands the signal and knows what to do. Now, in many cases, the composer of the concerto was also the soloist, so he wrote it specifically to give himself an opportunity to show off. Now, if you were a brilliant composer and a virtuoso performer, why wouldn't you? The great Baroque composer Antonio Vivaldi was a virtuoso violinist, so it really shouldn't surprise you to know that a significant number of his concertos are written for the violin. Mozart was also a keyboardist, so he wrote more piano concertos than all the others combined. And what a coincidence! He was usually the solo pianist the night they premiered. Now let's talk about Vivaldi for a sec, because he was an intriguing historical character. Vivaldi, first and foremost, was a priest. He was known as the Red Priest because he liked to wear red robes and also because he had thick, curly red hair. Yay for the redheads! He was a priest who never conducted Mass. Now, Vivaldi claimed it was because he had asthma and didn't have the stamina to get through a whole Mass. However, others claimed it was because he kept ducking out to write down musical ideas that popped in his head during the service. He was assigned to teach music to children at an orphanage in Venice. Naturally, he recognized the potential of a captive orchestra that could accompany his own violin playing. So even though they were all children, he taught them to play well enough to give concerts. And most of these concerts featured, wait for it, Vivaldi. Even when the concerts took a break for intermission, Vivaldi kept right on playing solo violin in the theater to keep the audience entertained. He was a real showman. Now, of his 800 total compositions, 500 of them were concertos, and half of those were violin concertos. Probably one of the most remarkable things about Vivaldi was that he was never controversial. He was the one musician in history that actually behaved himself. He was happy, full of energy, he had a good sense of humor, he was faithful, he paid his bills, he had no addictions, he was never moody, he loved children, he respected authority, he never got in trouble. Kind of breaks that old stereotype, doesn't it? Now, I can't mention Vivaldi without mentioning the Four Seasons, probably his most famous set of compositions. The Four Seasons were 4 separate violin concertos, with one for spring, one for summer, one for autumn, and one for winter. The various melodies and rhythms in the Four Seasons are supposed to represent the sounds of each of those seasons. For example, in spring, you can kind of hear bird calls in the music, a thunderstorm and a barking dog. In autumn, you can hear hunting horns and blowing winds. And in winter, you can even hear freezing rain and chattering teeth in the music. It's so cool. This was a radical concept for the time, as it represented telling a story without words. Now, later, when the 19th century rolled around, composers would make a whole career out of that trick. By the way, if one of these compositions is called a concerto, what do you call a group of them, like the Four Seasons? Is it concerti? Is it concertos? The answer? Yes. Both are actually considered grammatically correct. Concertos is more of an English language plurality, and concerti is more associated with Italian. So, to each his own. They're both correct. By the mid-1700s, tastes were changing a little, and composers got bored with the concerto, and it kind of lost its momentum. They felt like it had been played out, and they largely stopped writing them altogether, until Mozart came of age and changed all the rules. Mozart took the concerto, dusted it off, and basically revamped the whole thing, and brought the concerto back from the edge of extinction by giving it a new lease on life for a whole new generation of show-offs. He injected it with new energy and new ideas. In the Mozart version of the concerto, the orchestra was much larger and more powerful. Also, he kept the same three-movement structure, but changed the first movement so it more closely matched the first movement of a symphony, making it twice as long as before. But Mozart really upped the game by dialing up the difficulty for the soloist in the concerto, making the level of technical skill and virtuosity ridiculous. Plus, the dramatic back-and-forth potential was more properly explored so that it felt even more intense than before. Mozart also kissed the concerto grosso goodbye and focused exclusively on the solo concerto, honing that one-on-one drama. More than likely, it reflected his own view of himself as a me against the world situation. The next generation of great composers of the 19th century very closely followed Mozart's example, and the concerto enjoyed a huge comeback during the Romantic era. Now, let me give you a common dilemma of the time and see what kind of solution you can come up with. Now, typically, the upper-class families of Vienna loved to entertain guests and would frequently host huge dinner parties in their homes. And then after dinner, the children would be expected to perform music for the guests, basically to show off. Now, obviously, the perfect form of music to promote someone's virtuosity would be the concerto. But man, even the richest families didn't have homes large enough to accommodate a full orchestra. So without an orchestra to provide accompaniment for little Maria or little Felix, what could be done? Is there an instrument out there that could replace the orchestra and provide a full accompaniment for the soloist? Can you think of anything? Anything at all? By any chance, did you think of the piano? Well, if you did, then you just invented the sonata inside your head. A sonata is a concerto where the piano replaces the orchestra. It's like a mini concerto for home use. There's still a soloist, but the soloist is now accompanied by the piano. There are still 3 movements, and they remain in the basic fast, slow, fast format, but the piano allows it to be performed right there inside the house. No stage or auditorium necessary. So a flute sonata is flute plus piano. A trumpet sonata is trumpet plus piano. A violin sonata is violin plus piano. Hey, but wait, what if the solo instrument is the piano? Are there 2 pianos? No, just one. A piano sonata is just piano. The piano gets to be both soloist and accompanist. Also, since a sonata can be played in a room inside the house, you might be tempted to call it an example of room music. But that lacks pizzazz. See, in those big old houses of Vienna, the music room was referred to as the music chamber. Therefore, a sonata is an example of chamber music. That's where that comes from. Now, in one final sweeping change, the sonata lacks the argument nature found in the concerto. Now it's not soloist versus the piano. In a sonata, they're kind of both on the same team. The piano supports the soloist rather than oppose it. Now, not trying to outshine or argue, but working together towards the same goal. Good thing, too. Imagine a piano sonata where the performer had to get into an argument with himself. That'd be messed up. In a sonata, the dynamic shifts from opposition to partnership. It's still a conversation, but a supportive one, and not confrontational. Hopefully, understanding these elements, like the argument idea or the ABA structure, can help demystify this music for you. If you know what to expect while you listen, you'll be able to have those aha moments, and everything will start to click into place and be less overwhelming. Now, here's one final thought. Could this idea of a musical argument in a concerto or a musical dialogue in a sonata transfer into identifiable musical conversations in other forms of classical music? I mean, what about a symphony? Could you hear that as just one big group discussion? All the different sections of the orchestra contributing and responding to each other? Or a string quartet? Maybe like an intense committee meeting between 4 close colleagues. Thinking about music as conversation opens up a whole lot of possibilities to explore. Using the skills you already have in understanding human dynamics can open up a whole new way to connect with this music. You hearing things in the music you never noticed before. And on that note, why did Mozart break up with his piano concerto? I've already got a bad feeling about this joke, and I know how it comes out. Okay. Why did Mozart break up with his piano concerto? Because it just kept bringing up old themes in every single argument. Groan. Wow, that was something. But hopefully it leaves you with some smiles as you go listen for musical arguments and conversations. Thank you, everybody. This has been the Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening. Keep learning.
Continuate a ascoltare, continuate a imparare The Tom Daniel Show. Continuate a ascoltare, continuate a imparare The Tom Daniel Show. Prenditi una pausa dalla solita routine e sintonizzati su The Tom Daniel Show scoprirai il mondo delle melodie, storie che potresti non conoscere. Continuate ad ascoltare, continuate a imparare The Tom Daniel Show. Continuate ad ascoltare, continuate a imparare The Tom Daniel Show. Cosa stai aspettando? The Tom Daniel Show. Cosa stai aspettando? The Tom Daniel Show. Cosa stai aspettando? The Tom Daniel Show.